Hi, everyone. This is Rob Doggett coming to you from the State University of New York at Geneseo and on behalf of the International Yeats Society. And I'm here today talking with Gregory Castle. Hi, Greg. How you doing?
I'm doing well, Rob. Thanks.
Great. And you're a professor of literature at Arizona State. And I think a lot of people will know you from your two monographs, Modernism and the Celtic Revival. And that came out in 2001, I think, right? And that is such an important work, and it's one where I kind of got to know you by reputation before meeting you. I also know you have the book on the modernist Bildungsroman, and lately you've been doing a lot of editing, including your recent book you edited with Patrick Bigsby, A History of Irish Modernism, which I haven't seen yet, but I'm looking forward to that. What are you working on right now?
Well, those two monographs you mentioned have spawned two lines of work. One on Irish revivalism and one on the Bildungsroman and the concept of Bildung. I've been writing a bunch of essays in both of those strands, and the one that's important for today's conversation is on Yeats. And so much of my understanding about Yeats and what I'll say today has been gestured at or drafted in these articles, chapters in books like The History of Modernist Poetry, things like that, companions. Mm-hmm. The Cuchulainn plays, the chapter in that Science and Technology, Irish Science and Technology book. Mm-hmm. So all these works have been, had led to what I basically am finishing right now, which is a monograph on Yeats.
That's great. I'm looking forward to that.
Worlds. What's that?
I said I'm looking forward to that. That's
well, I am too. I'm looking forward to it being published.
And that's the one on temporalities. Is that the
yeah, and it had a lot. I've decided to go with a shorter title and let an editor, decide if that's wise or not. Mm-hmm. I trust editors in that respect. They know titles. But the main points would have to do with recognition, temporality, and world making. Mm-hmm. They are the recognition aspect has to do in many ways with themes in Yeats's poetry. You could say that a poem like Meditations is in some ways an attempt to grapple with the misprision and the misunderstandings that have been circulating around the Civil War, which is, let's face it, a misunderstanding. That is rather bloody and violent. It is what Yeats calls bitterness. Mm-hmm. And I also discovered in writing about Yeats that this whole idea of Bildung was coming to the surface. Mm. As in terms of aesthetic Bildung in Yeats's work. And I'm working on an essay now that considers Yeats, Wilde, and Bowen in terms of the Irish Bildungsroman, the modernist Bildungsroman. And I mean, looking at Yeats's autobiographies. So the idea of aesthetic Bildung has been coming into view for me. And in a lot of ways, I see Meditations as a reflection on that, or at least a phase of his development. Mm-hmm. At this point in his life, what is he, 58? Mm-hmm. This is 23, so yeah, 58. Mm-hmm. He's a freshly married, recent kids. This is the main context for me, I think, of the sequence of poems. But there is a relation between them that we might discuss as part of my introductory remarks.
Yeah, well, that's what I was starting to think about that. And I usually ask why people chose the poem they did, and you're going to be talking about Meditations in Time of Civil War, of course. So why did you select that poem?
Part of it is I like this. I like Yeats's sequence poems, and I just thought if I tried to do, say, 1919, the ghost of Michael Wood would be standing behind me. I don't know if I want that. It's such a great feat, that book. But I think it's partly because it to me it's a threshold work. That is the Tower as a whole, but these sequence poems, Tower, Meditations, 1900, that really offer these wonderful meditations on historical reality. Mm-hmm. I've been thinking so much about this phenomenological idea of the artwork as a world. Mm-hmm. that is made up of really two worlds: the world of representation, or what's given to representation, and the world that you might say is the inner life of the work. It's what the work expresses on its own. And you can't really imagine a work that's pure expressiveness. And I don't mean modernist expressive form here. I don't want to invoke that. This is more a later phenomenological notion of the depth of feeling of a work, of the way that it responds to the depth of feeling in the spectator. I'm referring to Miquel Dufresne's the phenomenology of aesthetic experience, which in my work with this monograph on Yeats is one of my principal resources to understand Yeats's career. That is, from the earliest poetry to the last, but also the plays, the autobiographies, and a vision. Yeah. So
I've seen a lot of people.
So meditations kind of encapsulates all of the, I think, central dynamics of what I was seeing throughout the canon, but does it in this graceful sweep of 7 poems.
Yeah, it's such a it's one of the works that really got me interested in Yeats. When I was younger, I knew a lot of the love poetry, and then some of the canonical later ones, especially like Sailing to Byzantium, and such a different poem, and reading this type of poetry that is with meditations that is historically engaged, and yet so aesthetically effective.
Yeah,
Really,
those early works in Sailing, which seem to sort of tilt in the direction of the imaginative world that is being portrayed. And Yeats learned this as a folklorist. He learned about the other world of fairy. And as symbolism and other early modernist movements helped him come to understand, the artwork too had a kind of otherworldliness. And phenomenology just kind of philosophizes that recognition on the part of the artist. Yeats was coming at it from another direction, the spirit world, which is active in his imagination from the start. But in the years preceding meditations, say Paramica Silentia Luna, the Paramica Silentia Luni, you're going to have to cut this part out, and let's say that the title Paramica Silentia Luna, that wonderful essay of 1917 that responds to his understanding of Swedenborg at that time. He's developing the very earliest sort of gestures toward, not the very earliest, there's
a little bit earlier about a vision, but yeah, this is really getting
Bardic early on. That's giving us a kind of an early indication. But all of this has already been happening before Meditations is written in 23, and then there's actually, I think, more of a flavor of it in 1919, a few years before. But I think there are ways of looking at the poem, and I'll mention it near the end, that kind of links us up with that spiritual inheritance.
Well, let me share the screen, and we'll start looking at the poem. There we go. Can you see that?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, great.
I just scroll up so you see those first stanzas.
Okay. Oh, you mean right like this?
Oh, you got a page break. That's okay, right? Like that's fine.
Yeah, I've got a page break in there.
This is his classic stanza formation. That those. Think of the greater romantic poem that M.H. Abrams had us think about, and this sort of stanza style is reminiscent of that. And I've always enjoyed these. They're great for narrative poems, and they're also great for the way Yeats builds this opening to the poem, much in the way that the door provides an opening to the house. And there are, that threshold imagery kind of resonates throughout the poem. But, one of the reasons I like the sequence is that it begins with this big question about the greatness of art and the bitterness that might underlie it. And though he doesn't, you might go back up just a moment, because these opening lines, so they don't state it expressly, are about the great promise of the Anglo-Protestant big house and its culture, its cultural elites, you could even say, that is celebrated in so many poems in the volume following the Tower. But also you can go back to what the poem on the agitation. What is that? Great house shaken by the agitation.
Oh yeah, by the landlord. Yeah. Yeah.
Let's get the title.
Upon a house shaken by the
On
landlord.
a house. Yeah, thank you. We can leave that in. Titles are fun to play with. But from that early time, Upon a House Shaken, you have the same. Yeats is beginning to develop that some call it an idealized vision of a certain social order, or one could also call it a particular world that he is creating that can accommodate the unity of culture that he strives for. That he finds so disappointingly impossible to maintain in, our social order. Much of his thinking about this kind of unity, which has got a long heritage that goes back at least to Kant and Schiller and those folks, the Weimar people who gave us the concept of Bildung, in fact.
Mhm.
But this thought of acquiring, and Schiller calls it personality, a kind of unity of self that was possible in these ancestral houses. And let's scroll down a little bit, but just so we get mere dreams at the top, because even here, as Yeats will do in these sequences, this in 1900 is to invoke dreams in a negative way.
I tried to, sorry, I just changed it.
That's good. That's fine.
That's better so you can see it more clearly.
Yeah,
There we
that's
go.
perfect. I can see the whole first one because these mere dreams are later invoked um, in part 5 when we have the cold snows of a dream. But as I'll suggest later, we're dealing with an ambiguity here because typically in Yeats, dreams are a positive thing. The dream state is a positive thing. Robertes alludes to it regularly, and there's Michael Robertes, that is the character of his fiction. And you get a sense that here he's thinking that the mere dreams are dreams that have soured. And one of the things that stands behind these poems and is addressed directly in 1919 in the mockery section is that dreams, as powerful as they are, can also harm us when they come up against reality or fail to come up against reality. And there's a sense in which these violent, bitter men there in that third stanza have, after that invocation of mere dreams are no longer the site of this phallic, fountain of dizzying creativity. They appear now to be, just conniving, financiers who are able to afford either afford great art or patronize it, that is, sponsor it in some way. But I don't get the impression that here you have people creating great art.
So we have this earlier time of creation, and then we have the descendants who are the people occupying these houses, these ancestral houses, sort of mouse-like.
That's right. You have the originator, the say the speaker, who has commissioned the ancestral house to be built, who has designed the great rooms, who has hung paintings in them, who has commissioned art. Perhaps in Yeats's case created it, but largely he is referring, as he does in my table, to the rich inheritor. It's as if, by acquiring the art, he inherits it as well. But the main point is that there's something here that the rich, violent man has managed to create, the ancestral house, with its escutcheon doors and its fine galleries and gardens, that he's afraid will not be will not be properly assessed and adjudged by, here it's suggested by his his descendants. Later it's made explicit in part 3.
It's one of these, this first section or this first poem is one that my students sometimes have a hard time with because of the associations they have with wealthy homes, and not just the whole 19th century legacy of these Protestant big houses, but also a sort of American I think resistance to rejection of sort of wealthy people and suspicion of wealthy people, and sort of this a certain kind of wealthy people, and it's this sort of old money idea. And so I often have trouble explaining to them why Yeats would see value in that kind of culture. And I think the the elaboration of the house and of the gardens and that sort of thing, the suggestion of visible reminders of a kind of continuity, is something that's important and that we can value, even though we recognize the problems as well.
In explaining it's that this sort of social strata, this social caste, it's great house, it's big house to students. It is useful to suggest that it is the expression of continuity, an expression of history and even of tradition. But even that falls flat when we know that such continuities can be oppressive and burdensome.
That's right. That's right. Of course.
But there's also an element here that I think is more apparent in the opening of 1900, that these are things, these are beautiful objects that the poet is invoking at the beginning, the potential of creating, and gradually by the end worrying about their preservation in that sense that say Heidegger gives it, that art requires a preserver. Art requires some kind of, in order to ensure its continuity, one has to ensure its value. And how do you ensure its value? You teach it. You know, you or as a critic, you announce it in your work. This is not criticism now. This is something else. This is, I mean, kind of like an explanation. I mean, the main thing that should puzzle students is, what is this greatness bitterness thing here? That's this question, this Yeatsian question at the end of the part. And this is a major theme, a major repeating theme in the late work. Usually you have the honeybees and bitterness, honey and bitterness, sweetness and bitterness combined. And here, greatness and bitterness is I think a kind of an interesting conjunction. And I wanted to pull up this quotation from Bakhtin about greatness. And he writes that it is impossible to achieve greatness in one's own time. Greatness always makes itself known only to descendants, for whom such a quality is always located in the past. It turns into a distanced image. It has become an object of memory and not a living object that one can see and touch. This idea that greatness is always for the future, I think, is what's maybe the biggest sort of point we could make about this section, is that a question is always open in the future. You know, a question is always waiting to field an answer that is yet to come. And Yeatsian questions are, I think, deliberate invocations of a future in which whatever is that issue, the dancer and the dance, that sort of thing, whatever is that issue can be resolved. There's a sort of perfect sense, sort of sensibility of so many poems that put things into this futurity that is also something we can talk about as having already begun.
That's interesting. And this notion of multiple, I mean, we're getting at multiple temporalities being evoked in his poetry.
So yeah, and this is announced here in a kind of a subtle way, because on the one hand, he's talking about the continuity you mentioned that such ancestral houses automatically kind of stand for, but it also is sort of central to the Civil War. It's deeply buried, but these houses were decapitated throughout the war. They were brought down, 2,000 of them, if I remember correctly. Not Cool Park. That just kind of fell down. But, you know, think of Bowen's The Last September and you get a picture of what happens to these places.
Yeah, and such a fantastic novel, I think, to help people get a sense of what's at stake in those big houses, and that really amazing ending to that novel.
And you could send your students who have the awareness of the social disparities that the Great House, you know, sort of stands for, and that's a good way to understand it, even though it's from the point of view of the Anglo-Protestants. Lois, the narrator, the protagonist rather, is not so much of that class as sort of, you know, she's an orphan really. She's a strange little creature to be in that world, and she's not emblematic of it, which is partly her fate. And this would be Yeats's problem, is she wants somebody emblematic of this world to preserve it, to understand its greatness. And what does the second poem do but establish his own tower in County Galway as an exemplar, with its ancient bridge and its ancient tower? I'm just reading those opening lines. A farmhouse that is sheltered by its wall, and then we have here an acre of stony ground. So there are two ways in which Yeats draws upon the actual world in which he writes. Ancestral House is sort of a hybrid of one way, and that is to talk about his own house. Ancestral Houses really invokes a kind of dialectical image of a kind of, well, he calls it an emblem of adversity, like a dialectical image of this adversity. And I mean here the kind of thing that Walter Benjamin talks about when he sees the historian creating an image in which the past is brought into the present and kind of held there, still active, still past, but held for our redemption, you know, for our new assessment.
Hmm.
Like like the stationary blast of the waterfall that Wordsworth talks about in the Prelude, where you have an image, a waterfall, but it's also it's at one and the same time stationary as an image of a waterfall, but it's also a blast because it's a waterfall is nothing if it's not a falling and a making noise.
To both of these things simultaneously, and I think that's right. But so the evocation of the ancestral house is more generalizable tradition, and then Yeats's tower, where he's living off and on during this period.
You want to talk about the dialectical image of his own tower, I would go to the stairs nest. But here we get ahead of ourselves.
Okay.
Let's look at his house as he sees it entire, and it is itself a sort of a holdover from his symbolic period because it's got a lot of symbolic weight. It's got a lot of associations. You know, he talks at first. You know, he talks in fact after he describes the ancient bridge of where the symbolic rose can break in flower. This is a place where symbolic things happen. And if you don't have to know a whole lot about Yeats to understand how important the tower is, not only this structure, but the image of the tower, the semi-panoptic sort of point of view it provides him in the poem The Tower, but also the more Platonic sort of winding stair quality that is invoked here. That is the image of, I'll get it here, of El Penseroso's Platonist, this right out of Milton, this image of a kind of not quite secular artist, someone who is still close to heaven up in the tower. And when in Phases of the Moon in Wild Swans at Pool, Michael Robertes and Robert Ahern come upon a similar figure just before he starts to describe the system of a vision. And so all that symbolic weight is here. And in fact, he says a winding stair, a chamber arched with stone. And of course, his next book of poetry is called The Winding Stair. He's building a kind of iconography for this period of his work.
I think that's right. And you know, as you're talking about that previous stanza too, not just the symbolic rose, but just even those lines, old ragged elms, old thorns, innumerable, the sound of rain or sound of every wind that blows. These all feel so 1890s. I mean, just that recollection of Yeats from that period, and then the kind of the mysticism of the tower, the Platonist toiling on. There's so much of Yeats's own aesthetic legacy here in this stanza.
And here's where we can get the idea of recognition, misrecognition, and the kind of remediation that happens within the canon, where you see these images of the if you look at those opening lines where you just referred to them, but where you have the water hen and the plashing of a dozen cows, takes us back to Easter 1916.
Right.
That third stanza where he's experimenting with the intervention of another world into the world of his poem. Almost as if in that stanza, he has offered, you know, an opening. The three stanzas, that's the three stanzas that surround it, describe the main players and their fate in the future to be murmured name upon name. But before you get to that murmuring in the third stanza, you have the moorhens and the moorcocks, and you have the plashing of the rider, of the nameless rider on his or her horse. It is another, is like a flash of an image of that world forming around Cool Park by that time in 1916. That is more established by the time we get to My House and My Table. So that when he invokes the water hen and the splashing of a dozen cows, he's referring to that reality that he's already half created.
Mhm.
Well, as you say, in a way, it's looking back at his own work, and it's I wouldn't call it a correction, but I would call it in some ways a rectification, because now he has another context for it. Easter 1916 was one context, 1923 is yet another.
Yeah, that's interesting. That
And
makes
these
a
are
lot of sense to me. Yeah.
indirect juxtapositions worthy of his modernist, poetics.
Mhm.
Um,
And in
but
the
no, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was just going to say the last stanza, we also get the a man at arms, so we still have the connection with those violent and bitter men as well.
Yeah, yeah, that's where I was going to go with that. That is head towards that man of arms who is. You have Yeats in one of his inevitable dualisms, yearning as the El Penseroso's Platonist in his tower for the life of the active soldier,
Hmm.
of the
Hmm.
man of action, the man at arms who gathered a score of horse. And this is this is the way Yeats deals with antinomies, and well, not antinomies so much as binaries. These choices that he feels are limited to the two things that he is obsessed with. And in this case, at time of civil war, one can't blame it. I mean, he even envies the brown lieutenant later on for his activity. But note that here we have him um, reflecting on the man at arms in that second paragraph. I mean that last stanza of the second poem. Um, he reflects on his heirs, and that they may find to exalt a lonely mind befitting emblems of adversity. And here you get the sense that he is uh, establishing a standpoint, not for so much his descendants, for his bequest, for his act of bestowal. And you just have to think about the tower that precedes it in the volume and some of the later poems on up to Ben Bulben, and
Hmm.
you see this pattern of, of making a bestowal or planning a bestowal or understanding the past as his to bestow.
Hmm.
And that's where you get the Bardic Yeats, who is able to bring on to others what has happened in the past.
That fits in with what you're talking about or alluding to earlier with these alternative temporalities, is imagining some future time of people looking back at the art that Yeats has bestowed, understanding it then in a different way, precisely because they're in a different context.
You have remarkably well described the logic of misrecognition at work in Yeats's poems. That way in which the some meaning is posited for the future that then looks back upon what has occurred in the past, and a sort of new assessment or a new understanding has evolves out of it. It's not really about getting the right one, although you can't speak of a final recognition.
That's right. Different recognition. It reminds me of something you wrote, and I can't remember where it was, but this idea of there's always an initial misrecognition in the present. That's there's a necessary misrecognition.
Yeah, well, that is Zizek. That's
That's right.
Slavoj Zizek, who has theorized following Lacan, where méconnaissance, that mirror image we have of ourselves, is the initial, the inaugural moment in which we get it wrong.
Yeah,
But it's
yeah.
a generative moment, because how else are we going to function?
Hmm.
We don't have the real thing at our disposal.
It's interesting too. Think just, and we'll get to move. We should move to my table, but just another
Yeah,
thought as you were talking about Easter 1916. You think about the discourse of a lot of the rebel leaders as well. Has that notion that people do not understand it now, what's occurring right now. They're misrecognizing what's occurring now, but at some future moment will come to this alternative understanding.
that's right. I mean, this is how you read the last stanza of Easter 1916, as this murmuring name upon name is going to lead us into that future where we understand the nobility of these martyrs.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
What was it? Connolly, McBride, Pierce.
I write it out in a verse. Connell McBride. I'm sorry. Write it in a verse. My goodness, I can't remember it myself.
Well, I've got it right here.
McDonough, McBride, Connolly, and Pierce. Now and
Yeah.
in time to be wherever green is worn or changed utterly, a terrible beauty is born. That's
And there you have the people often snipe at Yeats for that use of green, and I'm just going to make this a very short remark, but I think that that's one of the ways in which the poem touches down on the historical reality of the rising.
And here, of course, though, as we're talking about this, there's so much uncertainty too in Yeats here this misrecognition here will lead to some recognition later. Will that actually occur? And he seems really uncertain about that.
I mean, this is, for England may keep faith. Will they be bewildered with an excess of love and those names that keep murmuring? That's for the future. So there is a sense in which something is commemorated, and this is a poem of commemoration as well as an elegy. The poem creates its space for murmuring, as sort of an aesthetic recuperation out of this violent moment in history.
So we've moved from these generalized ancestral houses to his own house, and now we're sort of crossing we're going more inward here, as we were talking about before this poem, with thresholds to focus specifically on the table.
It's almost cinematic the way it goes from ancestral houses to my house to my table. Close up of this heavy trestles and a board where Sato's gift the changeless sword by pen and paper lies, that it may moralize my days out of their aimlessness.
Can you talk for a second about Sato's gift? I don't know if I'm assuming some people listening to this might not know.
Well, during Yeats's tour in 1920, he was presented with the sword. I can give you the name here.
I think it was in Oregon, right?
Gunzo Sato presented it with him in Portland at his hotel in Portland, Oregon. The interested reader can go to Forster's book on his biography on Yeats to get the full story. But like the lapis lazuli sculpture that Henry Clifton gave him, these objects of art become, and I'm going to treat the sword as an object of art, become opportunities for Yeats to reflect on objects of art. And they're the way in which they both contain the changeless aspect of the work as expressed and the changeful aspect of the work as it exists in time. And of course, this sword is a work of art like any other, but at the same time, it's handed down through generations. It adapts itself to new temporalities, and as it goes from the Sato family to the Yeats family, you have a shift in geography and traditions and so forth that compound the alternative temporality that is invoked here. This is virtually this sword comes from virtually another world, in other words. Not only the historical world in which Yeats received it in Portland, but also the world that it comes to represent in his poetry. You find it again in the dialogue of self and soul, in the winding stair. And if you look at the way this is described, it's in Sato's house, curved like new moon and moon luminous, it may lay 500 years, yet if no change appears, no moon, only an aching heart conceives a changeless work of art. And so we don't get much information about the sword beyond that, do we? I mean, it's basically being invoked, aside from the fact that it's on a table. But if you go to Dialogue of Self and Soul, and I'm just going to flip over there in my actual book, and this is, I should have gotten the page number before I did this. This is in Winding Stair, as I mentioned. 234, it's almost there. And this is one of those great dialogue poems in which Yeats is able to argue with himself, where self and anti-self can come alive. But in that poem, the second stanza, the self writes, "The consecrated blade upon my knees is Sato's ancient blade, still as it was, still razor keen, still looking like a looking glass unspotted by the centuries." And there you have the changeless work of art. And this is in the second stanza of this classic, the second half of the stanza. That flowering silken old embroidery torn from some court lady's dress, and round the wooden scabbard bound and wound, can tattered still protect, faded and adorn, or it's still tattered, faded, can also adorn. So this, going back to my table, here you have this changeless work of art that has all, we aren't really alerted to it here, but has been wrapped with another kind of object that is not quite a work of art, that has its history with this court lady's dress.
Mm-hmm.
There's also the scabbard that we have now mentioned. So it seems to the sword has, to pun here, has entered history as if it were entering its scabbard. The poem, the sword re-enters Yeats's oeuvre, his canon, in Dialogue of Self and Soul in order to make the point that it is not simply a changeless work of art. Here in the Meditations, he truly wants it to be such. And that's what I think is the meaning of the second half of the poem, which has baffled me for years.
Okay.
That this is one of those instances where Yeats's syntax has something to answer for, aside from its beauty. And that's beginning with Soul's Beauty, that near the end there, if you put the last 10 lines there, soul's beauty being most adored, men and their business took the soul's unchanging look. That is to say, the men of business are getting soul. Mm-hmm. They're capable of adopting some aspect of changelessness. For the most rich inheritor, knowing that none could pass heaven's door that loved inferior art, had such an aching heart, could not help but have such an aching heart. Mm-hmm. Because the rich inheritor, and here's where Yeats's sort of social politics take a, the usual creepy turn. The rich inheritor is got the money to do so, mm-hmm. has the wherewithal, the cultural capital to stock a big house with fine art. This figure, although a country's talk for silken clothes and stately walk, had waking wits. Does this mean he's woke in our contemporary sense of being aware of something that had before been unknown to him? Or is it simply that he has come awake, he has awakened from a dream, the mere dream that we hear about in ancestral houses? However you read it, it seemed that there's an announcement of a new time, of a new dispensation, that Juno's paycock, that screaming, is an announcement.
Right, of some other revelation of time, like some other moment occurring. It's interesting, and I noticed, by the way, there's a typo here. It should be the soul's unchanging look in the scan I've got here. This idea here that the art object somehow shapes the soul of individuals, so that we inherit this sword, and the person becomes somehow like the sword, like it.
Yes,
like
yes.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And it's art as like the art object is changeless, but as you're saying, it's also constantly changing because it's interacting with people, right?
Exactly. Yes, because it and not just in the simple sort of boneheaded sense that the artwork hangs in a museum, but in the sense that an artwork often can become an object of a kind of use. I mean, look what happens in the Phantoms section at the end of Meditations. In a sense, you have well, not in a sense, you do have a glittering sword out of the east that kind of ushers in these phantoms, mm-hmm. these images. And so that's Sato's sword in use, just as Sato's sword is later wrapped in the fabric from a court lady's dress. There's a grounding, a touching down on that world given to representation that Yeats is invited into the poem. He's emphasized it. Look at the title, for crying out loud.
Mm-hmm. You said, I think what you said is so important, and it's one that I try to. It's a point I make with students a lot when we're talking about art in Yeats. We're not talking about the way that we're not only talking about the way that we're used to thinking about art as something you see in a museum, but as something that is in these homes. And it goes back to the ancestral homes, this idea that we have art in our lives, that they are objects, and as you're saying, an object that has a use value that is used, but is also has an aesthetic value, and that those are intertwined. They're not
This is very
separated.
Wildian, you know, this
Yeah.
idea that the beautiful object can also be useful to you in life, even though he says, you know, art is useless. If you read his essays on decorative art and home decoration and so forth that he wrote early on, before the plays and so forth, before his one-liners, he makes a case for the decorative object as he says that uh, all art is decorative art.
Mm-hmm.
Yeats is suggesting something like that, although he's not going that far. I mean, with Sato's sword is it's a gift, it's a bequest, a bestowal upon him, which then becomes something for him to bestow upon his heirs. And it's not for nothing that part 4 is called My Descendants.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's move into that.
And to make one final note, it's not for nothing that this rich inheritor is now presented in a positive light, because he is now something like this rich inheritor, because he has gathered around him in his own tower all these great, wonderful things, all his golden bees, Phidias's gold. He's gathered them all around him. And now he becomes somebody who has something to bestow. Compare that to the wealthy man in responsibilities who refused to subscribe to his scheme for pictures, for a picture gallery. But my Descendants brings us not only back to ancestral houses, but to the form of ancestral houses.
Mm.
So I'll read the first 2 lines and we can scroll up. I'll go back to it in mine's so covered with annotations. Having inherited a vigorous mind from my old fathers, I must nourish dreams and leave a woman and man behind. This would be Anne and Michael. As vigorous of mind, and yet it seems life scarce can cast a fragrance on the wind, scarce spread a glory to the morning beams, but the torn petals strew the garden plot, and there's but common greenness after that. It's like that mouse that, you know, is skittering around the ancestral house. And you have a return to the classic, stanza form here, this 8-line stanza form that is identical to ancestral houses. And it's almost like an elaboration on the underlying anxiety of the rich inheritor for his own descendants. He has himself been a descendant, an inheritor of this rich tradition. And here we jump out of Yeats's family, because he didn't inherit this from John Yeats. Mm-hmm. He inherited this from Gregory, from Augusta Gregory, from John Synge, from the literary revival, from Cool Part, from his own dreams of the tower. He effectively, talk about an alternative temporality, he created an alternative genealogy that would allow him to speak of inheritance in this way, that he could situate himself. The rich inheritor in part 3 is clearly the man of business, but I think he sees himself too as someone who has inherited richly and is in the position clearly in part 4 to bestow.
And then the problem, of course, of imagining, the bestowing is an attempt to somehow fix what will occur in the future, and get the awareness that there's no assurance that the descendants will follow in his example, will embrace the bestowal, that all this may fall away and could turn into this kind of common green.
He can't do anything about it.
Yeah.
It's like the end of Wild Swans at Cool, the poem, where he imagines those swans and entertaining somebody else in the future, right, that he will miss.
Yeah.
And so this has been refined down to a more personal dimension, just as you've described it, this relation of himself to his descendants.
The stanza after that has a bit of people are familiar with all of the political discussions of Yeats. We'll start seeing some of the eugenics creeping into this stanza, right? About descendants losing the flower through natural declension of the soul, through too much business with the passing hour, through too much play, or marriage with a fool. And these fears about his children and their choices in marriage.
I'm sorry, repeat that again. Is this a question, or are you just...
I guess I was making a sort of making a statement.
I didn't want to miss the question.
As a question, yeah. What do you think of that? This sort of the way in which it's now connected with the with that sort of bloodline fear. So,
Well, I
so
see that, there's a lot of talk of breeding when Yeats starts talking about the Anglo-Protestant elite. Less so when he talks about the Gallo-Catholic, although a bit of it is there in On the Boiler. A piece when one writes about it, one is very ginger. But this idea that he brings up from an early mention of it in this is, I think it's in Green Helmet. Yes, upon a house shaken by the land agitation, which I mangled before. But in that poem, he speaks of the sweet laughing eagle thoughts that grow where wings have memory of wings, and all that comes of the best knit to the best. You follow that all the way to Under Ben Bulben, or the Frank speaking of breeding and the ill-bred. And I read this in terms of Yeats's anxiety about the incapacity of the Anglo-Protestant elite that he has half created in his own sort of work. Not the ascendancy, but the cultural elite that he associates with Synge and Gregory and the Gore Booths and a host of other families he sees his own family in that light. I think this is what I think is mourning in part 4. He writes a Gothic conclusion of his descendants before they've had a chance to grow up. It's my least favorite part of the poem, because I think he's developed this desolation, this desolate sky under which his descendants will exist, but he doesn't know that yet. He paints a better picture in Prayer for My Daughter, but in this poem, he invokes, and this is another way of responding to the question of breeding and of eugenics and race, as he's invoking a larger historical, even cosmic context for these questions. First of all, when he talks about the ruin that the owl may build in the cracked masonry, which kind of invokes those stairs, those starlings in the next poem, but also the primum mobile that is mentioned in the final stanza, which is the Ptolemaic concept that invokes a certain arrangement of the spheres and so forth. That, well, what was Yeats doing in 1923 but finishing a vision, which was his own arrangement of the spheres, as it were. And I think we see invoked in this primum mobile, something like that cosmic context in which, despite what may have happened to my inheritance, despite what may happen with my descendants, we will know whatever flourishes and declines, these stones remain their monument in mind. Even in ruin, they've still retained their monumentality. So he's almost casting a certain future in which, if there's going to be a ruination of this house, if there's going to be a ruination of this social caste that I have romanticized and thought about so much, then it too will remain a monument. I posit it to occur. This kind of poetic statement about what will remain.
Thinking in two different, those different sorts of temporalities then, right? Imagining this kind of future where we have this desolation, things fall away, and then imagining that in this much broader mystical context, this cosmological context, where even ruin...
They don't preclude each other.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
And when you read a vision, you see how important the individual human life is to the construction of a cosmological view of time.
It's interesting.
And if you see revival, as I do, as the production of time and not as a hang up about the past, then you can see that this poem is central to Yeats's revival aesthetic. And just for the reason that you mentioned, this relationship with the future, which is then, after casting this Gothic vision into his and our aesthetic experience, we get the affable irregular in part 5. This moment, one of two, the Stairs Nest is the other one, where the historical moment of the Civil War intrudes upon the poem. We have this heavily built Falstaffian man cracking jokes of Civil War as though to die by gunshot were the finest play under the sun, and then the brown lieutenant and comes into play here with his uniform, and it's a foul weather, and then a pear tree broken by the storm. This is very interesting this comes with the Moorhens in the next stanza, so that you have almost as if the dynamic of Easter 1916 were replayed in what, 15 lines.
Mhm,
It's
mhm.
a it's an amazingly economical poem in that respect, where
I
it
love the connection to Easter 1916. That makes a lot of sense here.
and to itself, if you go back to the more, or to the water hens invoked in part two of Meditations, I mean, this is the way that Yeats builds continuity, not through any kind of historical causality or chronology, but through the way that these images, many of them, dialectical in Benjamin's sense, that is, they're capturing something on the move. And you
Mhm,
might be that these moorhens are just that kind of image.
mhm,
And it's amazing the way he melds the image of the affable irregular and the brown lieutenant, and these weird descriptions of brown lieutenant as the uniform. And
mhm,
it's an interesting sort of detail that comes at us along with the foul weather, hail and rain. And there's really, it's because the poet feels that he's nonsensically complaining about the hail and rain that it's there at all.
mhm,
Because he's, there's that famous anecdote that somebody knocked on Yates's door and says, "Excuse me, Mr. Yates, we're going to be blowing up your bridge pretty soon. We just thought,
mhm,
you know,
mhm, mhm.
so this relation to the war that somehow suggests a weird sort of respect and communality between the opposing sides, which I don't think was the case. Although I can believe the story. I can believe that there might be some slack cut to figures like Yeats and Gregory, who were on the good side of the spectrum of the Anglo-Protestant ascendancy. I mean, Yeats wasn't of that ascendancy, but he
Mhm,
certainly hung around with it to the extent that he identified with it.
mhm,
Synge too. I mean, his family was knee deep in the ascendancy worldview, but he was able to virtually become you know not one with the Aran Island people, but he certainly was welcome there, and he built a rapport that Yeats could never do, that Gregory could never do in their sojourns in the countryside.
One of the issues that comes up when I teach this particular poem, "The Road at My Door," is that the envy, the line, "to silence the envy in my thought." Now, before this, we have the irregular who's on the Republican side of the Civil War, and he's presented in this kind of mocking way, the Falstaffian guy. And then we have the Free State lieutenant who's also kind of mocked with his half dressed in national uniform. And then they kind of blend into the bad weather and the whole sort of absurdity of things going on here, this conflict, the chaos of the conflict. Um, and yet the speaker here seems, well, I guess this is the question: is he envious of these people? And if so, why would he be envious?
That you're that's a good question, and I think I, as well as students, have gotten hung up on this passage because it does suggest that he envies the man of action. Um,
Right.
that
Yeah, that's where that's usually where I kind of go with this, that even though these people are absurd, they possess a kind of certainty that the speaker does not, and he's perhaps envious of that kind of certainty, or at least momentarily envious of that kind of certainty.
and it could be the moment, now that you mention it, that he recognizes what he has misrecognized before, that his envy is the envy of this violence. Let's put it in a word.
Yeah.
Uh, that
Yeah.
that the affable lieutenant, that the affable irregular nevertheless represents, with all his Falstaffian accoutrement. He is
Hmm.
still a man of violence.
Hmm.
Now, where did these moorhens come from that are mentioned in that the middle, or the second line of the stanza? He says, "I count those feathered balls of soot the moorhen guides upon the stream to silence the envy of my thought." This is what silences that envy, is this counting. But is it a scene he sees before him? Is it a scene he remembers? Is it a scene that he conjures? Because the moorhen has a symbolic, or I would say imagistic importance. It's just what it is. I don't think it's a symbol of anything. I think this image of the moorhen is simply the image of the moorhen. And it's for that reason all important, because it's the intrusion of nature, of the sensuous, before it has been formed,
Mm.
that silences the envy of his thought, as if to say, pay more attention to this world rather than that world.
Mm.
And that's when he turns towards my chamber caught in the cold snows of a dream. And you could see this as a retreat. You could see this as a kind of, a way to reject the historical realities around him. But I see it rather as and this is maybe saying the same thing, and it may be just a rhetorical difference, but the turning towards the chamber, and chamber is an interesting word because it suggests the fullness and roundness of the world. And if you look at the way Yeats uses not only dream but the word cold,
Mm-hmm.
if you go back to the fisherman, well, you don't have to go far back, just the previous volume where he speaks of, if he could just get it right, if he could represent finally that fisherman, that he would be able to create a passionate new dawn.
Yeah, cold and passion is the
Yeah,
dawn.
yeah.
Yeah.
And you see it in a cold heaven. You see it in
Yeah.
a couple of poems. This idea of cold and dawn, of cold and new beginning, being conjoined. So the cold snows of a dream could be like something like that, where cold is associated with passion.
Huh.
It's the kind of passion that
Huh.
he will associate with aesthetic experience, not the hot passion that
Right.
blows, rhetorical passion that he, thought Duffy was too full of, Charles Gavin Duffy was too full of. But the kind of cold passion of the artist who's shaping joy is really an expression of this um, a silencing of envy. There's another poem, I think is it Vacillations, where he also has to speak of a certain silencing um, of, uh, of creative ambition that he frets about. And maybe it's 1919. The image is floating up in my head.
I wonder too, as you're talking about the moorhens, these balls of soot, as you were saying before, unformed, reminding me as well of art and the idea of art as something living that becomes in the future. And so there's a kind of aesthetic connection as well, that brings comfort here. I think
You're right, and that's one way of seeing the connection on 1916.
yeah, that's
Because
really interesting.
because at this point in his career, in fact, beginning a little bit earlier in the mid-teens, Yeats is moving away from that symbolic notion of beauty as something ethereal and perhaps eternal, absolute, and so forth. Right back to Kant, that aesthetic notion of beauty. But he's now seeing it because he's had time to reflect on the influence that Synge has had on him.
Mm-hmm.
So if you look at the essay on Synge, if you look at the poetry of responsibilities and Wild Swans and Cool, you see that his notion of beauty is undergoing a transformation to where we get to the point of moorhens become a more indicative image of the beautiful than a ethereal woman, a fairy woman dressed in white moving through marble halls.
Mm-hmm.
Which the Wind Among the Reeds is the great example of that point of view. But now that you mention that, let's just go to part 6, which is, I think, an extension of that. It builds on that moorhen association with the starling. And here you have, after the first stanza, which introduces the scene that the bees are building in the crevices of his tower, and this is a kind of not only a building of communion, but an opening. His world there's an opening here. This isn't the ivory tower. This isn't, some enclosure or some, panoptic prison. He's inviting the bees, opening up the tower himself, his work, to accommodate them, because this in some ways is an empty house, because it has not yet been colonized by the stair.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So it's only empty insofar as the starlings have not come to build there. But if you go to the stanzas that follow, you have 4 lines of brutal reality. We are closed in and the key is turned. I think of the end of T.S. Eliot's Wasteland. There's a moment where he invokes this lack of control. The key is turned on our uncertainty, not to open it and to be more certain, but to lock it in, right? To lock in our uncertainty. That's just one reading. Mm-hmm. Somewhere a man is killed or a house burned, yet no clear fact to be discerned. Gosh, that sounds frighteningly like our own day.
I was thinking the exact same thing, and I've had moments over the past year, where I've thought a lot about this particular poem and how effective it is, right, to read it in our particular moment in the United States here.
It's just, and it's so, I mean, think of the opening of uh, Second Coming, you know, with that contrast between those who have no conscience or constancy and those who have
Yeah,
nothing
the
but
best life, all conviction, while the worst are full of passion and intensity. Exactly.
yeah, exactly. This is another statement of that, but I hadn't really put it together with our own moment. To just as I was reading, I'm going, geez, this is exactly true. And there's nobody here playing what I'm going to call, just for the sake of, you know, test it out, the bardic role of announcing, "Come, build in the empty house of the stair," which is not just an announcement, but an invitation for a
Mhm,
certain kind of future,
mhm.
not a totally discernible future, because you know, I guess you can predict what honeybees will build. So there is some sense in which it will be a sweet future, not a bitter one. And here again, the emphasis that contrast between honey and bitterness, greatness and bitterness is here implied in a different way from, say, Ancestral Houses, where he
Mhm.
asks, well, can we deal with our great accomplishments if we have to at the same time accept the trivialities and violence and corruption that underlie them?
Mhm.
Here, that argument has been broken down to its bare minimum, because now we have civil war, we have people at each other's throats, and we have people killed and houses burned for no discernible reason, and barricades, and just 14 days, just 2 weeks,
Mhm.
fortnight, 14 days of civil war, and they trundled down the road that dead young soldier in his blood. A great line.
Mhm.
Um, in his blood, nobody else's, his, not the general's blood, not the Anglo-Protestant blood, not the British Army's blood, but his blood.
So
And
to the connecting back to part 4, the idea of the ruin. If it becomes a ruin, there's also the bestowal. Even if the bestowal fails, the desire to have some kind of order in the imagining some kind of transformation in the future. Even in the ruin, there's an opportunity for creation. There's an opportunity for something new. Um, and so and this bardic idea of evoking it, and it's really beautiful, I think, in the face of this present awfulness, to imagine that kind of.
would you see it then as an appeal to the sweetness of our nature?
Yeah, I think so. I think that the alternative to that last line, which is I find so powerful reading in our context today, we had fed the heart on fantasies, the heart's grown brutal from the fair, more substance in our enmities than in our love, and then the appeal for something else that
Yeah,
we
and this time, oh, honeybees in midline, where normally
right.
the grief would continue. Um, yes, this appeal to the future, to someone to make something out of this crevice, this loosening masonry, and you know, this idea of crumbling and loosening masonry across modernism is
Yes,
is
yes.
is emblematic of not only of what, you know, those 24 statues and crate of books that Pound talks about and Hugh Selwyn Mauberley. I mean, this is not only an emblem of a civilization that has crumbled, but it also is also an emblem of an opportunity. It is also an opportunity insofar as it becomes an emblem,
Mhm.
which is what this part is doing here in the penultimate section. And it's also what, say, the Dawes Nest is doing in the tower,
Yes,
where you
yes.
have this enigmatic moment where suddenly birds are building nests in the middle of a poem that's reflecting on inheritance.
Mhm.
And it's another moment like Easter 1916, where the sensuous world, the world that literally grounds art by making it possible through providing its materials, right? I mean,
Mhm.
voice, paper, pen, ink, stone, coming to have its say. Yeats recognizing what he might have misrecognized before, coming to have its these objects, these moorhens and these starlings and these daws, they come to have their say, and their say is, and I think this, here you're absolutely right. What they have to say is they're talking about art in a new way. This is not the idealist notion of beauty that
Hmm.
philosophical aesthetics has given us, although it is grounded in it.
Hmm. Hmm.
But it has taken another turn, and we see it in Crazy Jane. We see it in the Circus Animals' desertion at the end of his life, this being grounded in a mound of shit, if you pardon the
Hmm.
expression, or
Hmm.
being essentially the ground on which ladders are positioned so that you
Yeah.
can rise. And it's a wonderful moment of that other Yeats scholars, many Yeats scholars have noted this recognition that transcendence is somehow bound up with immanence.
Mm. And then Yeats is such a great poet, um, because you can see a lot of poets ending with that poem.
That would have been the ending.
That would have been the ending. And then we have this just brilliant and strange, I see
Yeah.
phantoms of hatred and of the heart's fullness and of the coming emptiness.
Yeah, this I see in my reading of this poem. You have to read it, but we won't today. Read it with the final section of 1919, which is similarly apocalyptic. Is a sort of chaos of images that seem to flow from another world, the world of unicorns, the world of fairies and of monsters, and Robert Artisan. And in this case, you have a historical figure, Jacques Molay.
Mhm.
And in fact, he is invoked early on in that second section. But if you look at the first stanza, he establishes the poem in the autobiographical, historical reality of his tower. And he sees valley, river, and elms under the light of a moon that seems unlike itself. We're starting to get a little bit unreal now, right?
Mhm.
This unlikeness, this lack of semblance that seems unchangeable. So now the reality of his environment is like Sato's sword.
Mhm.
It's
Mhm.
becoming artistic. And then I think as the description moves, where we find, I'm going to look in my book because that type's awfully small. Where we find frenzies that bewilder, reveries that perturb the mind, monstrous familiar images that swim to the mind's eye. This is the opening in the poem that lets us into the world that is then described.
Mhm. Mhm.
And what's interesting is he begins with vengeance upon the murderers with Jacques Molay. And I'm going to inject just a little personal note here. Jacques Molay is, of course, one of the founders, if not the founder of the Masonic order, or at least an early champion of the order. I don't have, read Elizabeth Cullingford's wonderful article on this, on
Yeah,
Jacques
how
Molay.
Jacques Millet got up in the tower.
Yeah, yeah, it's a great article, great
Yeah.
article.
Oh yeah.
But I had my own experience with that because my father was a Mason, and he this is his ceremonial sword, right? Finely engraved. Look at that,
Uh-huh.
right? Ceremonial sword that I, the big hat and everything. Um, but I, as a 14-year-old, was inducted into the International Order of de Molay,
Wow.
which was the youth branch of the Masonic order. And I bring this up only because, one reason I picked this poem and like this poem is that bare reference kind of hooks into my own life and to a certain kind of ritual practice that my father I did it for him. He wanted me to do it. And I did it for him for about a year. And I brought my then girlfriend, who was in the Rainbow Girls, which was the, order for women. But she was barefoot, had flowers in her hair at the time. So that didn't really go over well with the other Masons. So I didn't last long as a de Molay. But it speaks to what R.F. Forster has called the sort of Protestant magic that artists like Yeats dabbled in, their interest in Freemasonry and their interest in ritualism. Yeats's longstanding interest in the spirit world, although I think it goes well beyond what Forster is identifying. I think it's more than just magic for Yeats, although magic is a part of it. There really is a spirit world to believe in. And I think here in part 7, we're seeing in some ways one of many descriptions of that world. And because he's a poet, I mean, you're going to get an imagistic treatment, and you're going to get, not only the rage-driven, rage-tormented, and rage-hungry troop, but those magical unicorns that bear ladies on their backs. This is how literature creates worlds, in part by creating an atmosphere through language that others, this aesthetic space, this is not a world of people necessarily, although you could do the same thing like Joyce does say in Ulysses, where, human beings enter into their own strangeness, that because language is what you have to work with as a writer, you create that world through the atmosphere that language can generate, which has a capacity of creating new modes of duration, that is to say, temporal modes.
Mm-hmm.
Here you have, and I call them time signatures. Here you have a time signature of succession without end. There really is no narrative here. This is just one thing piled onto another. No prophecies remembered out of Babylonian almanacs have closed the lady's eyes. Their minds are but a pool where even longing drowns under its own excess,
Mm-hmm.
right? Longing, desire has no object in the future here. It simply drowns in itself. So there's a sense in which time is not annihilated so much as compacted into a simultaneous moment that is defined by this torrent of images, the innumerable clanking winds that put out the light of the moon. This image, this idea of putting out the sun, putting out the moon, putting a stop to time, is not an end of time, but an introduction of another way of understanding it, succession without end. Or you might call it simultaneity, a kind of simultaneity without progression. You could even speak of a durationless duration in some senses, like in Vacillation, where he imagines a kind of timeless moment. But timeless moments are never timeless, because you can have a moment in which temporality appears to have stopped or been suspended, or has simultaneously so many things have happened at once that you can't keep track of any kind of time. Because if you think about it, time is an inner sense, as Kant puts it. It's how we develop our sense of space by figuring out duration.
Mm-hmm.
Space is the outer sense, time is the inner sense, and temporality is the way we construct time. Historical temporality by calendar, or by my watch, or my Outlook calendar, and all those other temporalities that for Yeats, as this last section so clearly gives evidence of, that are both historical, reference to Mole, but also fantastical, that come out of image systems. And in some ways, the final stanza, which in terms of its standpoint is replicating the way that part 5 ends with that, I turn away and shut the door.
Yeah.
And on the stair, because he's got the winding stair, so he's away from the roof of the tower where he had been before. He's now turned away from the roof, from this visionary space. Mm-hmm. That tower top is the aesthetic space in which he is able to create this world. Mm-hmm. That is in part a vision, because he sees it as a world. He both invents it, but also recognizes it as a world. Mm-hmm. There's that Wordsworthian half create, half perceive. In this sense, he never stops being a romantic, because he understands the way that his own human actual experience must intersect with and ground the aesthetic experience that he describes. That in many ways, this section is simply a kind of exuberant example of. You could say that this final stanza is Yeats's own aesthetic experience, as he imagines this world of unicorns and phantoms and brazen hawks and so forth. It's not self-delighting reverie so much as pure invention. And it's the invention of an ambitious heart, as he says in those final lines. Had such a proof drawn forth a company of friends, that is, if he could have done what you were talking about earlier, if he could have been that affable irregular, if he could have been that man of action, would he have had the same kind of friends around him? Would he have had a loving circle of friends that he would then have to miss more profoundly? I mean, in The Wild Swans They Cool, and in memory of Robert Gregory, Major Robert Gregory, he had pretty much given us his statement about what that pining would be like, because there he pines for Robert Gregory and for Synge, in a way that brings them back at the same time, that ushers them into the circle of his poem, that gives them a vital life in his memorialization. It's not just a static nostalgia for their life, but a commemoration of their continuing life in his poem. That last, look at the last stanza sometime of In Memory, and you'll see how he addresses the very issue that he's been trying to grapple with. You know, can I do this? Can I bring them back to my fireside? So speaks of that same company of friends here, the same ease of conscience that he has wanted then. What does he settle for, or seems to settle for?
It's fascinating that in that context, because I don't normally connect this poem with In Memory of Major Robert Gregory, and I think what you're doing with this last,
but it did come to me just now.
What you're doing with this last poem changes a lot of the way I think about the entire sequence, because I've often read it as sort of the, a continuation of his concern about the feeding the heart on fantasies, etc., and trying to come up with, trying to respond to that. And that's how Jacques Millet fits in that sort of thing, vengeance for the earlier murder, and then we're in cycles of bloodshed, etc. You're talking about a whole different outpouring of this itself as this aesthetic vision at the end, this attempt to encompass it all in this just such a difficult task.
And it's another future.
Yeah, I was just going to say that. Yeah, different future. Yeah.
And so it plays to this production of time that I think the poem is about. It's meditations at time of civil war. It's not plural, right?
Meditation
in time of civil war. So he is announcing, he's having it both ways, because he's announcing the poem is about the Civil War, but it's really about meditations that just happened to occur during that time.
Mm-hmm.
And the meditations overall have more to do with the issue of generation, of inheritance and bestowal, and B, the question of the aesthetic object and its relation to time.
Mm-hmm.
And both of those things kind of combine in that relation to time.
Mm-hmm.
And they both require a progressive form of, of recognition, of coming to terms with the way, say, the sword operates, or the way that the ancestral house operates, because the ancestral house comes before my house.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at the tower in the last section where he's at the rooftop having a vision of phantoms and unicorns, you can see that the poem is almost, I don't want to say self-correcting, but it's kind of self-rectifying. Mm-hmm. He seems to put right his own vision of the ancestral house as he goes along, so that you really don't have one image of it. Which is why so many of them aren't really dialectical images, because they seem to be images in the stage of the poem's development through its parts. Yeah. And with the titles, it does this in a more emblematic, or more direct and insistent way than, say, 1919, whose conclusion isn't as positive. But you could also argue that the invocations there are in the service of this similar sort of drive on the artist's part to exemplify the life of the image.
It changes so much the tone of how I read this poem, what you've done here. It really, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I
was just going to say, I mean, it is such a affirmation of art in a way that I had not thought about the poem. I think of the affirmation and the hope coming in the stairs nest at my window section, and then this strange falling away in the last part. But there's such a fullness, which makes sense, right? Vision of the heart's fullness, the fear of the coming emptiness. But here art can do something that has such value and importance in the face of that possibility of that emptiness.
So even longing, which drowns under its own excess, emerges in a kind of positive way, because that excess is in fact the excess of his art.
Yeah.
These images, this tumult of images that crowds through these stanzas, and that finally reaches that bit of wisdom at the end, which is where Yeats refers again to the language of a vision, because abstract joy is the joy one feels in those primary stages of the great wheel, towards the end of the second half.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not abstract joy is still joy.
Mm-hmm.
And that half-read wisdom of demonic images, that may as well be a summation of a vision,
Mhm, mhm.
because he never could trust those
Right,
instructors of
right,
his.
right, right. Yeah,
So it suffices because it's what it is,
yeah.
in a sense. And it suffices him now as a boy, but in a way that he can now recognize that he couldn't as a boy, which because it was buried under, romanticism, nostalgia, fairy faith, and a lot of things that were really great for art, but were also not. He was too young at the time to really fathom where he was going. You could see him awakening. You could see it in the green helmet, and as
Mhm,
he goes into responsibilities after hanging out with Pound for a while, you can just see that shift. And he never lets go of revival. He never lets go of the central issues. And look at the Cuchulainn plays. There's evidence enough right there.
yeah.
But he keeps altering the terms of the engagement. And I think here in Meditations, you see a crucial pivot, a pivot moment, where he is able to talk about this historical moment, but really as a moment that's part of a much broader one that involves his own auto/biography, because his autobiography is not a conventional one. But also, there's something about national Bildung going on here that's tied into his own aesthetic Bildung,
Mhm.
which is pronounced at this period, because he's in the 90s. He had to deal with the whole idea of national Bildung as a way to build self-help among the new nation's citizens. But if you look at it as the growth of the country and the importance of the Civil War to that growth, you could see a convergence of the development of the nation and the development of the poet at this crucial point where he's a mature poet, and he's it's a turning point in his thinking about, as we were speaking earlier, of his thinking about aesthetics in general.
That's, I think, a perfect way to end, Greg. That was terrific. It's really changed, as so many of these conversations do, changed the way I think about the poem, and I appreciate that.
Well,
It's
I didn't want to disappoint, because it's a big, big, important, complex poem.
well, that's great. Well, thanks so much for doing this, and I
My
appreciate
pleasure.
you taking some time to talk about Yeats. And we are, and both of us had that moment of sort of chilling moment, thinking about our own times and the sort of confusion and despair we can kind of feel in these moments. And I think there's one good response to that is to talk, endlessly talk about art and
That's right.
the, yeah, this
That's
affirmation.
why
I
it's why
think
1919 follows Meditations, even though it's an earlier poem about an earlier period, because here the message is far more positive.
yeah,
It's as if the rectification came in advance of the error.
that's interesting. Well, thanks so much. That was great, and this is going to give people a lot to
Great
think
poem.
about. Take care.